Mayfair, London, November 2019. A Russian billionaire sits at his usual corner table in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. 3 Michelin stars. A tasting menu that costs more than most people earn in a week. The sommelier approaching with a decanted 1982. Petrus has served him for the past 14 months. The man waiting for his wine had coordinated the assassinations of 3 Russian dissidents on British soil. His network provided cover for FSB officers, funded surveillance of defectors, and helped plan operations that killed people under British protection. For years, MI6 documented his crimes. Legal options failed. Diplomatic pressure failed. He was untouchable. What no one in the restaurant knew was that the sommelier was an MI6 officer who had spent 14 months building toward this single moment. The decanter contained a compound that would stop the oligarch's heart before dessert. The man he trusted to select his Bordeaux was about to pour his final glass. This is the story of how MI6 turned fine dining into an execution. Sergei Volkov was not a typical oligarch. He maintained residences in London, Monaco, and Moscow. He held British citizenship acquired through the investor visa program in 2003. He donated generously to museums, universities, and political campaigns across party lines. He attended charity galas where he was photographed with cabinet ministers. He owned a Premier League football club for 3 years before selling it at a profit. On paper, he was exactly what Britain claimed to want: a wealthy immigrant who contributed to society and played by the rules. What the public did not know was that Sergei Volkov ran intelligence operations for Moscow on British soil, not passively, not reluctantly, actively and enthusiastically. His network of companies provided cover for FSB officers operating under commercial pretense. His properties housed surveillance equipment targeting Russian dissidents who had sought refuge in the UK. His charitable donations purchased access to politicians who could be assessed for recruitment or manipulation. MI6 had documented his activities for over a decade. They knew which FSB handlers received instructions routed through his consulting firms. They knew which payments funded the surveillance teams that tracked defectors through London streets. They had compiled evidence that would convict him multiple times over in any court willing to hear it. No court was willing. Witnesses who agreed to testify reconsidered after visits from men who knew details about their families. Evidence was challenged on national security grounds that prevented its disclosure. Political pressure materialized from donors who valued Volkov's contributions more than abstract concerns about foreign intelligence. Diplomatic complications threatened relationships with allies if Britain acted too aggressively against Russian interests. Every legal avenue closed. Every prosecution stalled. Volkov continued operating with the confidence of a man who understood exactly how untouchable he had become. Then came Salisbury, March 2018. 2 GRU officers deployed a nerve agent on British streets, poisoning a former Russian intelligence officer and killing an innocent woman. The operation exposed the extent to which Moscow considered the UK a permissive environment for assassination. The political calculus shifted overnight. MI6 reviewed their files on Russian intelligence assets operating in Britain. Volkov's name appeared repeatedly. His network had not directly supported the Salisbury operation, but it had facilitated similar actions in the past. 3 deaths over the previous decade trace back to operations his infrastructure had enabled. He was not merely gathering intelligence, he was helping Moscow murder people under British protection. The decision was made at the highest levels. Sergei Volkov would be eliminated in a manner that could never be officially attributed. Understanding why he had to die requires understanding what Sergei Volkov had built. Sergei Volkov was born in Leningrad in 1958 to a family with connections to the Soviet security apparatus. His father was a mid-level KGB officer who ensured his son received the opportunities such connections provided. Volkov joined the KGB in 1980 after completing studies in economics. He served in the first Chief Directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations, until the Soviet collapse rendered his employer obsolete. When the USSR dissolved, Volkov recognized what others saw as catastrophe as opportunity. He resigned from the security services in 1992 and established a consulting firm in St. Petersburg that offered protection services to businesses navigating the chaos of early privatization. Protection was a flexible term. His clients paid for security. His competitors paid consequences. Within 3 years, Volkov had accumulated interests in aluminum production, shipping, and banking through methods that were technically legal only because the laws had not yet been written. His rise coincided with that of another St. Petersburg official. Volkov and Vladimir Putin had overlapping networks from the KGB years. As Putin ascended through municipal government to Moscow and eventually the presidency, Volkov maintained connections that proved mutually beneficial. He was never part of the inner circle. He was something more useful, a capable operative who could be trusted with sensitive tasks while maintaining plausible distance from the Kremlin. Volkov relocated to London in 2003, presenting himself as a reformer who had grown disillusioned with the direction of Russian politics. He condemned corruption in interviews. He donated to human rights organizations. He cultivated relationships with journalists who wrote favorable profiles of a new kind of Russian businessman. The persona was convincing because it contained elements of truth. Volkov genuinely enjoyed London. He appreciated its culture, its restaurants, its respect for wealth. He simply failed to mention that his appreciation did not preclude continued service to Moscow. His companies employed FSB officers who operated under commercial cover. His properties provided safe houses for surveillance teams. His social connections identified potential recruitment targets among British politicians, businessmen, and civil servants. He hosted dinners where Russian intelligence officers were introduced to useful contacts as business associates. The networking appeared innocent. Its purpose was anything but. 3 deaths over 11 years connected to operations his network had supported. A journalist who had investigated Kremlin corruption found dead in his apartment in 2006 from an apparent suicide that showed signs of staging. A former FSB officer who had provided information to British intelligence, killed in 2012 by a hit-and-run driver never identified. An anti-corruption activist who had traced money flows through Volkov's companies, dead in 2016 from a heart attack that his family insisted was impossible given his health. None of these deaths could be proven as assassinations in court. All of them connected to Volkov through evidence that could not be disclosed without compromising sources. By 2019, MI6 assessed Volkov as the most damaging Russian intelligence asset operating in Western Europe. His removal would cripple Moscow's ability to conduct operations in Britain for years, but killing a man with Volkov's resources required a weapon that would leave no trace. The assassination needed to appear natural. Sergei Volkov was 61 years old. A heart attack in a restaurant would raise questions, but not suspicion. Wealthy men of his age died suddenly with unfortunate regularity. But the method needed to be undetectable, even under thorough autopsy. It needed to be deliverable in a crowded public setting without witnesses noticing anything unusual. And it needed to be certain. There would be no second opportunity. MI6 Technical Services developed a compound specifically for oral delivery. The agent was a synthetic peptide that interfered with electrical signaling in cardiac tissue. Once absorbed through the digestive system, it would reach the heart within 60 to 90 minutes, disrupting the natural rhythm and triggering arrhythmia that would rapidly progress to complete cardiac arrest. The compound was designed to break down into metabolites indistinguishable from substances naturally produced during digestion. Standard toxicology screening would find nothing suspicious. The critical innovation was the compound's interaction with alcohol. The peptide bonded with ethanol molecules in a way that rendered it chemically invisible. Dissolved in wine, it became undetectable by taste, smell, or laboratory analysis, unless technicians knew exactly what to search for. The legendary complexity of a mature Bordeaux would mask any trace that might otherwise register on a sensitive palate. Delivery exploited the rituals of fine dining. A sommelier handling a decanter occupies a position of absolute trust. Guests watch the wine, not the hands pouring it. The angle of the body during service blocks sightlines from other tables. The ceremony of decanting commands attention toward the liquid itself. No setting offered more opportunities for unobserved introduction of a compound than the theatre of wine service. The device was elegant in its simplicity. A crystal decanter with a reservoir concealed in its weighted base, connected to the interior through channels invisible to inspection. Pressure applied to a specific point during the pour would release the compound into the wine stream. The action required less than a second. The mechanism left no trace. The decanter could be washed and examined without revealing its purpose. Testing confirmed reliability across hundreds of trials. The compound remained stable in wine for up to 6 hours. Delivery succeeded in 99% of attempts. The peptide's lethality was verified through controlled testing on tissue samples and animal subjects. Death would occur within 90 minutes of ingestion. The delay created separation between consumption and collapse that would obscure the connection. The weapon was ready. Now, MI6 needed someone who could spend over a year earning Sergei Volkov's trust. The operative selected for the mission had an unusual background for an intelligence officer. Before MI6 recruited him, he had trained as a sommelier in Burgundy and worked at 2-star restaurants in Paris and Lyon. His palate was genuine. His knowledge was not a cover constructed for an operation, but an authentic expertise developed over years of professional dedication. MI6 had recognized this skill set as an operational asset when they recruited him a decade earlier. We will call him Marcus. His real identity remains classified. Marcus had spent 10 years running operations requiring sustained cover in elite environments. He understood wealth and its rituals. He could discuss vintages with collectors who had spent lifetimes studying wine. He recognized the status signals that determined who belonged in exclusive spaces and who was merely tolerated. He moved through rooms where billionaires gathered with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his place through expertise rather than money. The legend was constructed over 6 months. Marcus Webb. South African by birth, raised in Cape Town by a British father and Afrikaner mother, trained in France at a prestigious wine school in Beaune. Employment history at restaurants in Paris, Geneva, and most recently Cape Town. References were established with hospitality contacts across 3 continents who would verify his background if questioned. A life was built from documents and relationships that would survive scrutiny from the most suspicious employer. The target restaurant was identified through Volkov's patterns. Lumiere had served him twice monthly for 6 years. Always Tuesday evenings. Always the corner table with sightlines to both entrances. Always accompanied by associates, whose faces MI6 had catalogued over years of surveillance. The restaurant represented his reward for success. His declaration that he had transcended the violence of his origins. He felt safe there in a way he felt safe nowhere else. The head sommelier at Lumiere was 63 and had spoken privately about retirement. MI6 accelerated his timeline through an offer he could not refuse. A position at an exclusive vineyard in New Zealand, managing their hospitality program at triple his current salary. He departed in June 2018 with gratitude for an unexpected opportunity. He never knew he had been moved aside to create a vacancy. Marcus interviewed in August. His credentials were impeccable. His tasting ability impressed the panel. His references confirmed a decade of excellence. He was hired within 2 weeks and began work in September 2018. The first months established credibility with staff and regular guests. Marcus made no approach toward Volkov beyond professional service. He recommended wines appropriate to meals ordered. He answered questions about vintages with expertise that exceeded expectation. He allowed his reputation to build through performance rather than promotion. By early 2019, Volkov had begun requesting Marcus specifically. Their conversations lengthened. Volkov enjoyed discussing wine with someone whose knowledge matched his own. He sought recommendations for his private cellar. He valued opinions offered without deference. 14 months of twice-monthly service. 28 evenings of building trust through shared passion. Volkov considered Marcus the finest sommelier in London. He had no reason to suspect the man who poured his wine was waiting for authorization to end his life. In October 2019, MI6 intercepted communications that transformed the operation from strategic priority to immediate necessity. Volkov was coordinating logistics for another assassination. The target was a former FSB officer living under British protection in Surrey. The man had provided crucial intelligence on Russian operations in Europe for nearly a decade. His information had exposed networks, prevented attacks, and saved lives. Moscow had wanted him dead for years. Volkov was 5 Oli, man up seeing it happen. The intercepts revealed a timeline measured in weeks. Surveillance teams were already tracking the defectors' movements. A method had been selected. Assets were being positioned. If MI6 did not act, another person under British protection would die on British soil. Authorization came within 5 days. The decision reached ministerial level. Legal options remained as closed as they had been for years. Diplomatic consequences of exposure were assessed against the cost of inaction. The calculation was unanimous. Volkov would be eliminated before he could facilitate another murder. Marcus received the activation signal on October 28th. The message was simple. Volkov's next reservation should proceed normally. Execution was authorized for that date. Volkov had a standing reservation for November 5th. Tuesday evening, his usual corner table. The date was fixed. The delivery device arrived at Lumiere on October 31st, concealed within a shipment of crystal glassware from a catering supplier. The invoice listed 12 wine decanters. 13 had been packed. Marcus identified the modified unit by a small mark on the base and transferred it to his personal locker without attracting attention. He tested the mechanism twice in his apartment. Pressure on the designated point released a measured dose into the pour stream. The action was invisible. The function was flawless. The extraction plan was straightforward. Marcus would complete service for Volkov's table, then depart at his normal shift end. He would take the Eurostar to Paris that night, traveling under his cover identity. By the time Volkov collapsed, Marcus would be beneath the English Channel. By the time investigators began asking questions, he would have ceased to exist. The 1982 Petrus was confirmed in the restaurant cellar. Volkov had ordered this wine 3 times previously with Marcus. He trusted the sommelier's handling of precious bottles. The recommendation would seem natural. The evening would seem normal. On the evening of November 5th, Marcus arrived at work carrying the instrument of Sergei Volkov's death. Marcus arrived at Lumiere at 4:30 p.m. for the evening shift. He stored his bag in his locker and retrieved the modified decanter, placing it among identical vessels at the sommelier station. Nothing distinguished it from the others. Crystal, elegant, weighted base. One of a dozen decanters that would see service that evening. Volkov's reservation was for 8 p.m. He arrived at 7:58 with 2 associates, both known to MI6 as facilitators in his intelligence network. His security detail remained outside in the black Range Rover, parked where it always parked. Volkov disliked visible protection during meals. Bodyguards disrupted the atmosphere of refinement he paid handsomely to enjoy. The corner table, white linen pressed without a single crease, crystal glassware arranged with geometric precision, candlelight softening the faces of wealthy men, discussing matters they assumed no one could overhear. The soft murmur of privilege at leisure. Marcus approached at 8:15 to discuss wine selection. Volkov was in excellent spirits. He had closed a significant property transaction that afternoon, a building in Knightsbridge that had taken 18 months to negotiate. He wanted to celebrate. He asked Marcus to recommend something exceptional. Marcus suggested the 1982 Petrus. Volkov had enjoyed it before. The vintage was legendary, one of the finest Bordeaux ever produced. The bottle in the cellar was in perfect condition. Volkov agreed immediately, pleased that Marcus remembered his preferences. His companions expressed appreciation for such generosity. Marcus retrieved the bottle from the cellar. He opened it tableside with practiced ceremony, cutting the foil cleanly and extracting the cork in a single smooth motion. He examined the cork for flaws, inhaled its bouquet, and nodded with satisfaction. He announced that the wine would benefit from 30 minutes in a decanter before serving. Volkov approved. Proper treatment for a great wine. In the sommelier station, Marcus transferred the wine to the modified decanter. As he poured, he applied pressure to the point on the base. The compound released into the stream and bonded with the alcohol molecules. The process took less than a second. The Petrus showed no change in color or clarity. Its legendary complexity would mask any trace of what had been added. At 8:47, Marcus brought the decanter to the table. He poured for Volkov first, then his companions, rotating the decanter slightly at the end of each pour to prevent dripping. Volkov swirled the glass with the practiced motion of a connoisseur. He raised it to his nose and inhaled deeply. He sipped, allowing the wine to spread across his palate. He closed his eyes briefly. "Magnificent," he pronounced. Exactly as remembered. Marcus returned to the sommelier station. His shift ended at 10 p.m. He maintained normal service for other tables for the next hour. He checked on Volkov's party twice, refilling glasses from the decanter. Each interaction was professional. Each pour was routine. Nothing distinguished this evening from any other. At 9:52, Marcus completed his shift paperwork. He said goodnight to colleagues with the casual warmth of a man looking forward to his evening. He retrieved his bag from his locker and departed through the staff entrance. A taxi took him to St. Pancras station. He boarded the 11:04 Eurostar to Paris. At 10:23, Sergei Volkov excused himself from the table. He walked toward the restroom at the rear of the restaurant. He collapsed in the corridor before reaching the door. Staff reached him within seconds. The restaurant manager called emergency services while a waiter attempted to find a pulse. Paramedics arrived at 10:34. Resuscitation efforts continued for 17 minutes. Sergei Volkov was pronounced dead at 10:51 p.m. By the time the pronouncement was made, Marcus was beneath the English Channel. By morning, he was in an MI6 safe house outside Paris. By the following week, Marcus Webb had resigned from Lumiere for family reasons and vanished completely. The sommelier who had served Sergei Volkov for 14 months ceased to exist, as thoroughly as the man he had killed. The death of a Russian oligarch in one of London's finest restaurants generated immediate headlines. The irony was too rich to ignore. A man who had survived the violent chaos of 1990s Russia, who had outlasted rivals, eliminated through methods far cruder than fine dining, had collapsed in a temple of civilization while drinking wine worth more than most cars. The tabloids wrote about hubris. The broadsheet speculated about stress and excess. Nobody wrote about assassination. The autopsy found evidence consistent with acute myocardial infarction. Volkov had no documented heart condition, which raised questions among family representatives who insisted he had been in excellent health. But cardiac events in men of his age were not unusual. Rich food, fine wine, the pressures of managing a business empire. The coroner recorded natural causes and released the body for burial. Russian intelligence was not satisfied. Volkov had been a valuable asset whose death was inconveniently timed. FSB forensic specialists arrived in London within days, officially present as representatives of the grieving family. They requested tissue samples. British authorities, seeing no reason to refuse a routine request regarding a naturalized citizen with Russian business connections, complied. The Russian analysis searched for compounds that standard toxicology would miss. They found anomalies. Peptide fragments that did not fit the profile of natural cardiac failure. Trace metabolites that suggested synthetic origin. The findings were not conclusive. The compounds had degraded significantly. But Russian intelligence assessed with high confidence that Sergei Volkov had been assassinated. Moscow knew. They could not prove it, but they knew. No formal protest was filed. Volkov's death eliminated complications for certain Kremlin factions, who had grown concerned about his visibility and his expanding network of relationships that could prove embarrassing if exposed. A quiet acknowledgement passed through intelligence backchannels. The British had sent a message. Moscow had received it. Volkov's network collapsed within months. His lieutenants lacked his political protection. His facilitators faced scrutiny they had previously avoided. 3 intelligence officers operating under commercial cover were expelled from Britain in early 2020. The infrastructure that had taken 2 decades to build disintegrated, without the man who had held it together. The operation against the defector in Surrey was never completed. The man Volkov had intended to kill remains alive under British protection. Intelligence assessments conducted in the years following the operation confirmed what MI6 had anticipated. Sergei Volkov had been the most effective coordinator of Russian intelligence operations in Western Europe. His network combined commercial cover, political access, and operational infrastructure in ways that had taken 2 decades to construct. It could not be replaced. The message reached its intended audience. Other oligarchs with intelligence connections understood what had happened, even if they could not prove it. A man who had considered himself untouchable, protected by wealth and citizenship and political relationships cultivated over years, had been reached in the space where he felt most secure. Legal protections had proven worthless. Social status had provided no shield. Several known facilitators reduced their involvement in sensitive activities within months of Volkov's death. Others relocated to jurisdictions they considered safer, abandoning London properties and British connections that suddenly seemed more dangerous than valuable. Russian intelligence operations in the UK decreased measurably in the following years. The infrastructure Volkov had provided was gone. Safe houses were compromised. Cover arrangements were exposed. Officers who had operated under his protection were identified and expelled. Rebuilding required time and resources that British counterintelligence could monitor. The defector in Surrey continued providing intelligence that proved valuable in understanding Russian operations across Europe. His survival represented ongoing damage to Moscow's interests. Every briefing he delivered, every network he helped expose, every operation he helped prevent was a consequence of Volkov's elimination. The man who had been weeks away from death continued living and continued talking. MI6 had demonstrated capability and willingness to act decisively when legal channels failed. The operation remains officially unacknowledged. No statement was ever issued. No evidence was ever presented. But its effects shaped Russian calculations about the costs of operating against British interests for years afterward. Yet the operation raises questions that resist easy answers. A man was killed in a temple of civilization. Fine dining, represents humanity's refinement, our elevation above mere survival into art and pleasure and shared ritual. The white linen, the crystal glasses, the sommelier's careful pour. These are the ceremonies through which we declare ourselves civilized. MI6 violated that space deliberately, transforming an act of communion into an execution. Marcus spent 14 months building a relationship that existed solely to enable betrayal. Whatever Volkov's crimes, he believed the sommelier was someone who shared his passion for wine. Their conversations about vintages were genuine. The expertise was real. The recommendations were sound, only the intention was false. Volkov died believing he had been poisoned by a friend. The utilitarian calculation appears straightforward. One man's death against the deaths he would have enabled. The defector who survived. The operations that were prevented. The networks that collapsed. The message that deterred others from following the same path. But intelligence work operates on probability, not certainty. The assassination Volkov was planning might have failed for other reasons. His network might have collapsed through natural attrition. The defector might have been relocated before any attack could succeed. We cannot know the future that was prevented. We only know the future that was chosen. States claim the right to protect their citizens through extraordinary means when ordinary means fail. The question is not whether such rights exist, but where the boundaries lie. When legal systems prove impotent, when diplomatic options are exhausted, when the threat is immediate, what actions become permissible? And who decides? Was Sergei Volkov's death justice or murder? The sommelier who killed him would say he was protecting his country. The law would call it homicide. History has not yet delivered its verdict.